No matter what we feel, no matter what we go through, prayer is important. Teresa struggled for years in dryness and difficulty. She struggled for years in mediocrity, but she kept at it. She was determined to pray and to keep opening herself. And eventually God's grace took over and more in her life. And that's the same thing with us. Prayer is about transformation. It's to free us to live a life in imitation of Jesus Christ. And it's only through prayer as friendship with Jesus Christ, coming to know that we're loved as we are, not as we want to be, that more and more we're transformed to live the Christian life.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of Institute of Carmelite Studies publications. For more information, you can go to our website at www.icspublications.org. And we're very happy to have with us our provincial superior and a great expert in prayer, and especially in Teresian prayer, Father Daniel Chowning. So welcome, Father Daniel.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And, throughout this whole season, we've been talking about prayer. And I think we've focused a lot about the period of prayer, kind of helping us grow in our prayer life. But all along, it has to lead to fruits and to really living life as prayer. And so I think this would be a great way to unfold kind of what does it look like to live a life of prayer?
Well, that's a very good question, because when we think of St. Teresa, we think of her as the great teacher of prayer. But oftentimes, when we think of prayer, we think of it only as an exercise that we engage in maybe several times a day in the quiet of our room or in a chapel at a church. But for St. Teresa, prayer is a way of life. It's a way of being. And I think in order to understand what that means, that prayer is a way of life, we have to understand how she understands prayer. You have to go back to the foundation of her understanding of prayer as friendship, because her understanding of prayer as friendship comes from her own lived experience. Her doctrine was not born from intellectual reading, but it really came from a real lived experience of friendship. If you recall, in chapter 8 of the book of her life, she defines prayer as taking time frequently. It's an intimate relationship between friends, taking time frequently to be alone with the one whom we know loves us. When we think about that definition, we have to consider her experience of friendship, because friendship is the key to understanding her life and her prayer. I don't think you can understand St. Teresa without friendship, because her whole life was one of friendship. However, friendship in St. Teresa had a positive side, and it also had, let's say, a dark side, a weak side. Okay, so her whole history of friendship, her history of relationships, influenced her understanding of prayer. I don't want to we can't go through her whole life right now, but just some of the important moments of her life where friendship was important for her and where she struggled with friendship, which eventually led her to understand that prayer and life go together. In other words, her understanding of that prayer and life are one emerged from a history of struggle with friendship, as I understand it. As you recall, her mother died when she was around 13 years old, and after that she went into a crisis. And the crisis surrounded a friendship. Probably a young man came to the house. In that time, in that period, boys and girls didn't get together like they did today. She says it was a girl, but scholars think it might have been a boy. We don't know. That's not, the important thing is that these friendships came to her house, and they were not good friendships. Her father was afraid that the friendships would lead her away from the virtuous path. They weren't good for her. And so she went into this crisis, and then afterwards her father sent her away to a convent school for a period of time. And that's when she decided to become a nun after some struggle. Then she enters the convent of the Incarnation. And in the beginning, when she entered, there was no teaching on prayer. The nuns spent many hours in the choir chanting the divine office with kind of detailed rubrics. And so she persevered, And at the age of 23, she became ill. She was ill right after her profession, and her father took her away to a place for a cure. And on the way, she stayed with her uncle, and her uncle gave her a book that was very influential. It taught her prayer for the first time, and it was called The Third Spiritual Alphabet, which actually presented prayer as a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
If you read it very carefully, The Third Spiritual Alphabet.
Yes, it taught a really deep prayer. It wasn't like kind
Yes.
of just how to say prayers, but really went deep.
And it encompassed a whole way of life, how you eat and how you live your daily life. And so I think it influenced her very much. And so after she went through this healing process and she returned to the convent, the monastery, and she began to practice prayer very, very seriously, and she underwent a conversion process. And she was actually paralyzed for about 3 years, almost paralyzed in bed, and she was healed through the intercession of St. Joseph. But she was growing. She was really going through a conversion process. And she was healed, and then she began to live the life of the convent. And then that's when friendships become a struggle for her. She had a great gift for friendship. She had a great capacity to love and receive love and to enter into friendships. But because of the situation of the monastery, of the incarnation, that were very poor and struggling, and they needed her to entertain benefactors, she entered into relationships that were not always helpful for her prayer life. And it was in that moment, in that period, actually a period of almost 18 to 20 years, that she struggled between what she says, between God and the world. Okay. In other words, her prayer was she experienced prayer in one way when she was alone, and then when she left prayer, she entered into all these struggles. See, so her life and her prayer were not united, and she realized that.
Yeah.
Anyway, in that experience, she came to understand her prayer and life had to be together, and that's when she had a conversion in 1554 between an image of the wounded Christ, and then 2 years later, in 1556, another conversion. But all of that is the background for her understanding that her prayer and her life had to be together.
Yes, how painful that division was
Yes,
for her.
it
She
was.
she felt it acutely in her life.
Yes, it was very acutely in her life. And the world for St. Teresa was not the exterior world. The world for St. Teresa was her own inner world of her affective disorder. Later on in the book of her life, she tells us what that meant, that struggle. You know, what was her problem? And she said that she knew that someone liked her, all she could do was think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And she was living outside of herself and other people at the expense of her own inner truth. And so this became the division within her. And that's when she understood that prayer and life have to be one. From her own experience, when her life was separated, her prayer was separated from her daily life.
I think you can say that this experience of her affective struggles also helped her understand when she did have her conversion how she could channel that energy.
That's right.
Right? In a really good way.
Yeah.
But it's good to know that she was just like us in that sense. I mean, how many of
Yeah.
us can relate to that? You know,
Yes,
that
exactly.
that the way that we can get preoccupied if we know someone likes us, or there's, just that we can go overboard in a sense of being too obsessive,
Yes,
over
yes.
some of our relationships.
Yes, that's
And
right.
how she really teaches us that, you can have that as your reality, but you can also move through that.
Yeah, because she realized that her relationships were not really grounded in God, in Christ, in her relationship with Christ. Actually, in her conversion of 1556, which came about through the direction of a Jesuit spiritual director, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, that's when her true friendships began. Her friendships were grounded really in her relationship with Jesus Christ. And then her life and prayer became much more one.
Yes. And so in a sense then even deeper than you could say her relationships was just, it became a way of being for her, right?
Yes.
That prayer and her life became so one that it's just the way that her way of being. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that, how that's possible.
Yeah. Because when she founded St. Joseph's Monastery, her first monastery in 1562, with a small group of women, they wanted to learn prayer. They knew that she was a great teacher of prayer. They had lived with her in the Incarnation, where she was a nun for 27 years. And so when she begins to teach them prayer, they say, "Mother, teach us what to pray. Teach us about prayer. We want to learn about contemplation and prayer." So she said, well, she doesn't begin with some method of prayer. She doesn't teach a method of prayer. She begins with how you live your life. She wasn't interested in teaching a method of prayer or prayers, but what does it mean to be a prayerful person? And that's why prayer is a way of being for her. And she stressed the three great virtues which were necessary to live a life of prayer, which was love of neighbor, detachment, and humility. There are three great virtues in which she said, well, you have to live. And if you don't live those virtues, you will not be contemplative, no matter what you think your experience of prayer is. But if you live those virtues, you will be a person of prayer. See? So they become like the authentic, the path of what it means to live a life of prayer. She realized you can't live a life of prayer if you're not in good relationship with the people with whom you live, if there's not peace. You can't live a life of prayer if you are totally obsessed with possessions. See? You can't live a life of prayer if you don't grow in self-knowledge, which is what humility is all about, see? So those three virtues really offer for St. Teresa a path of transformation. I guess she presented to her sisters and to us who read her that those three virtues lead us into a path of conversion and of transformation of who we are.
Yes.
See, and that's what prayer is. Prayer is a path of transformation. See, and so those virtues are what accompany us, growing in them, and they're a lifelong process.
Yes.
We don't just grow at perfect charity and perfect humility and perfect detachment, right away. It's a life of prayer. I mean, it's a way of life. It's a way of being. And so, but she was very astute, and that came from her experience of 27 years in the Incarnation.
Yeah.
Those virtues were so important, where she had lived in a previous monastery where there was a class system, where there was a division between, there were divisions in community and other problems. And so she realized that to live an authentic life of prayer, you have to live a life of virtue.
Yes. And that's a good, I think, tie into a great work that was recently published by ICS several years back, but about St. Teresa in that lens of transformation. And it's called the Way of Transformation, the spirituality of St. Teresa of Avila. And so it's just good to keep in mind that we can kind of go deeper into this theme. People can go deeper if they would like to. And I think what you said is strikes a real chord, because just like her nuns, her sisters back then, thought that, here's the spiritual master. And if we could just get a word like how to pray better, or how to, maybe have a different method of prayer, maybe she'll just have this like instruction for us that will just like help us get right to the goal, right to union, or help me have this great experience of prayer. And I think we can all kind of feel that way sometimes. Like if I could just, maybe learn from a teacher, or read this other book, or this other, instruction, or watch this other video, then I'll get better at prayer, and I'll be able to do it, or I'll be able to have this great experience of contemplation. But St. Teresa just helps knock out any of that kind of Gnostic tendency that just says like, the more I know, basically, then I'll be able to do this, and says no, like you said, it's so a way of being. It's so down to earth. It's so practicing the virtues that...
And it's living life. It's living life according to the virtues, the virtuous life, and a life that's focused on love. In chapter 10 of the book of her life, she says that when you begin the life of prayer, you become a servant of love. I've always been touched by that. To be a person of prayer is to be a servant of love. And if you unpack that, that means living a life of love of one another, and being aware of love in our life, and serving the Lord out of love, and serving one another. See?
Yes. And how would that look like in terms of forgiveness, let's say?
Well, she talks about forgiveness in chapter 36 of the Way of Perfection, when she does she comments on the Our Father, when she arrives at the point of the Our Father, where she comments on forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And she says something very, very important that's always really struck me. She said, unless you are willing, you desire to forgive. Now, forgiveness is not easy. We know that forgiveness is grace. It takes divine grace to forgive. But the willingness to forgive and to let go of bitterness is the authenticity of a life of prayer. So there again, it shows us how prayer and life are one. You can't be praying in chapel and holding grudges and bitterness. With that, you have to try to resolve it.
Yes.
You have to try to resolve your relationships. See, so that's an example of how prayer and life are one.
Yes.
Teresa stressed very much the life of virtue, much more than people often read it in her works.
Yes.
They think they read her as a great teacher of prayer and a contemplation, but it's in the life of virtue where we really find where we see the authenticity of our life of prayer.
Yes, and again, and it goes back to her name, Teresa of Jesus. I mean, that is the way of Jesus. And you think of how much he emphasized living a virtuous life, how much he emphasized forgiveness as a path to be forgiven, as a path really to be able to be united to God. And if you don't forgive, it just blocks all that. And so it makes prayer a farce almost. If we think we're people of prayer, but we refuse to forgive. And not that, like you said, it's not easy to forgive. Sometimes we still have to struggle with the bitter emotions and we keep going through it, but we're willing and we're aware of it and we're willing to try, at least.
She was very aware of human nature, and especially when you live close to people, and that forgiveness is a grace. But the willingness to let go of grudges and bitterness and to forgive and to reach out and forgive was essential. I think it's important. It's an interesting chapter 36 of the Way of Perfection. That God is a God of mercy, and we have to be merciful with one another.
Yes.
And later on in the Way of Perfection, she gives another example, I think, of how life and prayer are one, when she talks about the holier a person is, the more social a person is, the holier they are. See, and the more that we can be social and grow in relationships with one another, that's a sign of holiness.
Yes.
And she talks about affability and understanding other people, being affable and understanding of other people, not judging other people, not comparing our spiritual path with another spiritual path. See, accepting people where they're at and not being overly shocked by the way other people are living, and then become critical. See, these are the social virtues of St. Teresa, which again point to the importance that prayer and life are one.
Yes, exactly. And it helps kind of clear some of that sort of cloudiness that makes you think like, oh, if I want to be more prayerful, more holy, it means, I'm kind of go off in a corner, or I'm a little more, and sometimes we do have to withdraw from certain situations, of course, and to have more time for quiet, no doubt. But it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you become aloof.
That's right.
And that the person who's very prayerful, doesn't laugh or doesn't have just kind of good, joyful relationships, and that it just helps you just hone that. It kind of roots us in a good, realistic sense of what it means to be loving and joyful, and that's all connected to prayer.
Another text that's very important for people who read St. Teresa is the Book of the Foundations, chapter 5, where she talks about the importance of, she talks about prayer again, that prayer isn't thinking much but loving much. And then when she goes on to describe that, it's not loving only when we're in quiet prayer, but it's loving in life. And then she says, when you don't have enough time for prayer, whenever it's a matter of obedience and charity, that becomes prayer.
Yes.
Even if you don't have a lot of time for personal prayer. But if you have to respond to God's will in your life out of obedience, not just obedience to some superior, but obedience to life itself in many ways. We have to accept life as it is under God's conditions and respond, and to respond in obedience in that way and out of charity, that becomes prayer.
Yes.
And she said it's a crazy thing to think that we can pray only when we're off in a corner. See, she said we can love the beloved everywhere. No matter where we're at, we can love the beloved. She has a wonderful text in chapter 5 of the Foundations. So that shows too that prayer and life are one.
Yes.
It's you can't really separate. Definitely we need times of prayer to be alone. She's not saying that, but we can't divide our life, separate our life, because our whole life is one of prayer, really. And it should be. As we grow, it should be more and more. As we grow, our whole life becomes one of prayer.
And that helps give us peace too, because there are times like we have all the intentions, good intentions in the world to have our time for prayer and to really give ourselves to it. But then things come up, or we get interrupted, or someone needs something from us, and we can both feel guilty, but also get kind of annoyed because it's like, well, I should be praying, and it's like, no, you should be loving, and love expresses itself in prayer, but also in these moments, you don't have to feel like you're somehow being unfaithful.
She has a wonderful text in the interior castle, the fifth dwelling places, chapter 3, where she talks about a delightful union with the Lord and a non-delightful. The fifth dwelling places are a level of prayer that's more contemplative, and can be an experience of prayer that kind of takes you out of yourself, kind of absorbs you. But she said when she talks about the difference between those two prayers, she said the real important part of that prayer is the non-delightful union, which is doing the will of God. And in that text, she talks about the worms that can eat away the ivy of our lives. Self-esteem, judging other people even in small things, not loving them as ourselves. These attitudes that we can have in our life that militate against the life of prayer. And then she goes on a few paragraphs later, and she says, this is a life of prayer. If you see someone in need, you help them. If you need to give your dinner away, your food away for someone who doesn't have it, do it. Okay. If you see someone praised, be glad they're praised, and not be jealous because you're not praised. See, those are the virtues that she said. This is really about what prayer is. This is authentic prayer. It's another example. It's a beautiful text.
Exactly, and this is not the kind of like lower regions of prayer. We're getting to
Yes.
the highest regions. This is fifth mansions, fifth dwelling places, and you can still see that this is so pertinent throughout the whole process of spiritual growth.
And it calls us to examine ourselves in our life of prayer. How are our relationships with one another? How are we? Are we willing to die to ourselves, to give ourselves away out of charity to another person by our generosity, our patience, our understanding, helping people in whatever way we can? That is prayer. Yeah. Because if it's love, it brings us close to God, because God is love. And so wherever we're trying to grow in love, we're close to God.
Yeah. And that will draw us back to prayer too. That helps recollect us. You think you could spend an hour in the chapel and be just distracted and dry and all over the place. And then you could help someone in an act of charity and really just be peaceful and in yourself, in the Lord, so it's not like we're just going to prayer and then leaving prayer and coming back. It's like, no, those living that way actually draws us to prayer, and then we can go back to prayer more recollected, more at peace. So it's all connected.
Well, it's also one of the temptations of people of prayer. We can go to prayer because it feels good. See, we can go to prayer because we get spiritual satisfaction, which has value. But if our life is based upon our desire for consolations, and the life of prayer can be very subtle. Our attachment to how prayer feels. And I prefer that quiet, that spiritual feeling I have in chapel, and that I like to stay there rather than help someone. See, that's a temptation that I think all of us have felt at some point in our life, especially in the beginning stages of the life of prayer. Yeah. It's very, very, very easy to want to rest in the consolations of prayer rather than the God of consolations, as one mystic said.
And really, this goes into what we could say is the highest level of prayer, according to Saint Teresa, is spiritual marriage, is the seventh dwelling places, and yet in so much of that chapter, she talks about the fruits of prayer and what this really looks like when we're truly praying, truly in union. What does that look like? What are the fruits? We've already talked about life as prayer, but how does the culmination of prayer, in a sense, is something I think other than what we can often think.
She tells us in the seven dwelling places that all the graces of prayer have one purpose: to transform us into a life of imitation of Jesus crucified. It leads us to Jesus crucified. And by Jesus crucified, she means a life of self-giving love. It's not dolorism, it's not suffering for suffering's sake, but Jesus crucified represents compassionate love, love that's self-giving. And then she says, if you want to know what it really means to be spiritual, it means to be branded by the cross, to be a slave of everyone as he was. And if we unpack that, it means the fruit of prayer is service. Service, love. Gospel is evangelical love. That's what it's about, giving ourselves away in whatever way we have, in whatever circumstances we're living, by loving service, our patience, our forgiveness, all those virtues, that relate to how we love one another. And, that's the fruit of prayer. And then she'll go on in that same chapter, in the seven dwelling places, and she'll say, you have to don't build castles in the air. Start with the people you live with. by your kindness, your self-giving love, your humility, your charity. That's the fruit of prayer.
Well, I just a personal anecdote on that. I remember that I was really awakened to that when I was in seminary, and I was helping out with the Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa's order, and I remember having such great experiences of prayer with them. They live a very contemplative life, even though they're very active at the same time, and very very Teresian in that sense. And working with the poor and just being so joyful and just giving myself totally to the poor and throughout those couple weeks. And then my parents came and picked me up, and something happened. They said something, and I got real annoyed. I stopped talking to them for a little while, criticizing them, and it hit me in that moment. Wow, I can be so charitable with these other people, right? And yet where I am, where I live, my very parents, I'm not treating in a loving way. And I think these are those wake up moments where it's like, this is where you start. This is in your regular daily life, not in what some fantasy about what it is to live this holy Christian life.
It's interesting, that chapter of the 7 dwelling places, because she wrote that for the nuns, and the nuns said, well, I can't preach, and we can't do all these things outside. She said, well, that's not the point. Don't build castles in the air. Start with where the people you live with and love them, and that will have an energy to transform the world. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
That prayer is for the transformation of the world. See? And our prayer in our life, the way we live our daily lives, we're always in God. We can't be away from God. We live in God, see. And if we can just continue to try to be always aware of God's love in our life and trying to share that love with one another, we're going to be prayerful. And that will have a transforming effect on the world. Yeah. Maybe we can't preach, and maybe we can't teach. Maybe we're not nurses, or maybe we're not like Mother Teresa of Calcutta's sisters. But what kind of transformation will take place in my daily life with the people I live with if I'm as prayerful as I can be and loving as I can be?
Father Daniel, how would you, I guess you could say, summarize what we've been trying to do this whole season in Teresa's experience of prayer?
Well, if we look at the book of her life, you read it very carefully, one way to look at it is that Teresa says, I was a struggling woman for many years. And what changed my life was prayer. That prayer as friendship with Jesus Christ, loving friendship, coming to know I was loved. I mean, that's very important for prayer for St. Teresa, is spending time frequently with the one whom we know loves us. I mean, that's very key. It's coming to know we're loved. And opening to that love more and more into that intimate friendship transforms us. Because we cannot change ourselves. Only God can change us. And prayer for Teresa is the path of being transformed. By opening ourselves and letting God love us and cooperating with that as we go on and move in our life, we become more and more transformed. This is why in the interior castle and the 7 dwelling places, when she talks about spiritual marriage, she reminds the sisters and us that all the graces of prayer are to free us to live a life in imitation of Jesus crucified. So even though we strive to grow in virtue, we can only do that through the grace of God. That's why prayer is important. When we talk about life and prayer together, you need both. You need prayer, and you need to express that prayer in life. See? But it's only through the grace of God that we can be transformed, that we can imitate Christ crucified. As I said, Christ crucified being self-giving love. It's an image of self-giving love, that Christ died on the cross out of compassionate love for us. And we have to live that way, but we can only do that through the grace of God. And that's why mystical prayer is important. See? So no matter what we feel, no matter what we go through, prayer is important. Teresa struggled for years in dryness and difficulty. She struggled for years in mediocrity, but she kept at it. She was determined to pray and to keep opening herself. And eventually God's grace took over and more in her life. And that's the same thing with us. So I would say that in this whole season, that prayer is about transformation. It's to free us to live a life in imitation of Jesus Christ. And it's only through prayer as friendship with Jesus Christ, coming to know that we're loved as we are, not as we want to be, that more and more we're transformed to live the Christian life.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us this season, and please subscribe so that you'll know when our next season is coming out. And also, please feel free to leave comments too, and let us know what you think and how this experience has been for you. God bless you.